Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us for the 19th episode of YCP's virtual monthly series, Refiner's Fire. Every month, Catholic business leaders from diverse industries share spiritual and professional wisdom with us, all in short 30-minute live sessions. And in spite of the short length of these segments, we hope the tips and insights will be really valuable to all of us as we strive to work in witness for Christ this year. The name of our interview series, Refiner's Fire, comes from Malachi, where we learn that God is like a refiner's fire who seeks to purify us and make us the best we can be. And that's the whole point of this series. Through the inspiration and wisdom of these exceptional Catholic leaders, we're inspired to improve in small ways in our professional and spiritual lives. So let's be open to this journey of refinement, that in everything we do it aiming for that higher standard of excellence that gives glory to God. Our topic this month is Don't Take a Vacation from Vocation. We will discuss how faulty expectations can prevent us from living out our vocation both at work and in our personal lives. And we're also going to talk about how we can live our vocations to the fullest. I can't think of a better person to speak on this topic than Julia Hogan. She has spoken and written extensively on this subject. She's a licensed clinical professional counselor in Chicago, and she's the owner of Vita Optimum Counseling and Consulting. Welcome, Julia.
Hi, Jen. Thank you so much for having me today. I've been looking forward to it.
I know, we are too. Well, thanks so much for being here. And, as I was preparing for this time with you, I was thinking, I didn't originally think of expectations so much when it comes to fulfilling your vocation. So could you talk a little bit more about how these two concepts are intimately linked?
Yeah, of course. Yes, I think that, when we think of vocation, we tend to think, especially as Catholics, we think religious life or married life or maybe consecrated single life. And then we might think about what is our work? Is that fitting in with our vocation? But I think that, expectations, we adopt them and we don't even really know that we are. So we might say, well, this is what I expect my vocation to look like, or this is what I expect it to be. Maybe it's reaching people in a grand, big way, and we get discouraged by those little daily moments and we don't feel like we're making a difference or something like that. So I think expectations can be unspoken and implicit. And when we don't take that time to really investigate, like, what are the expectations that I have for myself, they can kind of, I think, become more discouraging for us. So we get stuck in maybe thinking, well, it should look this way. And if it doesn't, then am I doing something wrong? When maybe it's the expectation itself that's a little bit off.
That makes a lot of sense. And I could see how even the word should comes into our vocabulary and even potentially our prayer life more than we might realize. What are some signs, Julia, that the expectations we have for ourselves are actually harmful rather than helpful?
Yeah, you pointed out should, and I think that's a really big one. If you find yourself saying, well, I should be, in this particular position at work by now, or I should have this house, or I should be in a relationship, or I should be making X amount on my paycheck. I think that's a really good word to indicate, okay, wait, I'm putting myself in a box, and is this a box I actually want to be in? Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not, and we don't even realize that we're saying, I'm putting this rigid expectation, very black and white, right? If I don't have this number on my paycheck, I'm a failure somehow, or at least that's what I'm telling myself. When in reality, we're not looking at maybe the quality of the work that we're doing or if we're called to it. So should is a really big word to watch out for. I would also say if you find yourself comparing where you are to others. So if, thinking your expectation is, well, I need to be this person, achieved this status in the company at this age. Why haven't I done that yet? Or so-and-so makes their job look so easy and I'm so stressed all the time. What's wrong with me, right? So that comparison game, I think if you find yourself falling into that, that can also be an indication that maybe there's an expectation there you're holding for yourself that you haven't taken the time to really think, is this actually something that God's calling me to? Or is this maybe something I've learned perhaps in just growing up in society, maybe in school, maybe your career, careers can have their own sort of culture too, and expectations that they
Yeah.
put, I think like nursing or even therapy or
Mhm.
being in law or just consultant life, all of those things can have different sort of like cultures and expectations that
Mhm.
we adopt as we enter into those fields. So I would say those are really the two big ones, that if you're thinking, okay, I want to look into this idea of expectations, let me just kind of monitor my thoughts and my conversations, spotting those words like should or the comparison. Those would be like my two quick tips for that one.
Gosh, it's such good advice, and it's tough because we're almost in, sort of in this culture where we're bred to compare ourselves to others. I mean, it's all around us, so we really have to stop, like you're saying, and be more self-aware. Think of the words that we're using. Think of sort of the trap that we're falling into. And I loved what you said about, instead of the expectations we have for ourselves, it's really more about discerning God's plan for our lives. So it sounds like what you're saying is that we really should be active in sort of discerning God's will for our lives, and then really kind of seizing the day and participating in it. Can you talk about how expectations can play a role in fulfilling God's plan for our lives?
Yeah, I would say, I think a really maybe easy way to kind of frame that is, I think we can fall into one of two categories. So we can take the sort of like hands off the wheel, God's
Mm-hmm.
in charge, like there's literally nothing I can do, like whatever happens, happens. Or we can be on the other end where we think I've got to control everything because it's all in my hands. If something doesn't go perfectly, then somehow I've messed up or I failed, and God's going to be really disappointed in me. Those are both two maybe extreme versions of expectations, but expectations nonetheless. And so
Yes.
I've been trying to, both personally and then in my work with my clients, to reflect more on what does it mean to kind of be more in the middle there, and to
Mm-hmm.
take that sort of, okay, God is inviting me to do things, and I need to be looking for those invitations so that I can kind of, sometimes I call them breadcrumbs, like looking for that next breadcrumb, right? Because I
Yeah.
think we're always like, what's next? Or I want to get to the big thing, or I want to achieve my goal. And
Mm-hmm.
instead, I think it's helpful to look and say, okay, let me practice being active and participating in my life so that I see God in my daily life and where He's directing me, whether that's through a conversation or an email or a book I read or a prayer, any of those things. But if we're not looking for them because
Mm-hmm.
our expectation is maybe that it needs to be a lightning bolt from the sky or
Right.
something like super dramatic,
Yeah.
or that, we think, I don't know, I can't hear God's voice. Right? Those
Mm-hmm.
are all like layers of expectations that we place on ourselves. So I think that active role is thinking more, okay, it's a little bit of a dance, right? That God is saying, here's an opportunity, and I'm inviting you to pick this up, but I'm not going to force you to pick it up. So you have to be noticing those invitations when they come so they don't pass you by, so you can pick them up, right?
It's so true. And in that way, it almost becomes more fun and less daunting, right?
Yeah.
If it's something where it's not a lightning bolt like you said, but it's through our daily life. It seems more doable somehow. Do you have any recommendations, Julia, in terms of how we can just be more aware of our purpose and our vocation in daily life?
Yeah, I think a good place to start is really looking at what are some of your personal strengths
Hmm.
and things that you're passionate about and talents that you have. I think a lot of times we focus on what's wrong with us or where we need to improve and our weaknesses and all of those. But I think a good place when you're thinking about how do I play an active role in my day-to-day life and my vocation, thinking about, what gifts have I been given and am I focusing on growing those? And those
Mhm.
can be, an example I like to give is I have a friend who her gift is connecting people. So when I moved back home after grad school and I needed my first job, I reached out to my friend Bonnie, and she helped me find my first job. And then she helped me find my first apartment. And when I was like, oh, I need to find a primary care provider. Bonnie, who do you know? So she just has this gift of knowing people. And I use that as an example to say it doesn't need to be that you're, I don't know, like a gifted artist or a gifted
Mhm.
musician. I mean, those are beautiful things too, but we can also in that day-to-day life make connections with people and make a difference. And I think that's through knowing what we're good at, because we have been given things we're good at, right?
Totally. Absolutely. No, that's beautiful. And I just want to remind everyone listening, please be putting your questions in the chat for Julia, because we'll take questions in just a little bit. So I'm kind of jumping around, but I was just thinking back to what you were saying about some of these sort of harmful expectations. What if we've developed the habit of using the word should, that we compare ourselves to others? Are there any strategies where we can kind of unlearn some of these behaviors? I mean, what do we do if we say, oh no, Julia, I do these things. What next?
What next? What do I do?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that even simply through thinking, I'll explain it all, but following through that thought, right? And saying, if I have this expectation that I should have a certain type of job or title, and if I don't, somehow I'm a failure, to really think through that and say, okay, if I really believe that, what does that say about who I believe God is, who I think I am, right? That my worth is dependent on achieving this one specific thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so then to reframe that thought and to say, I can have goals for myself. There's nothing wrong with having goals, setting challenges for yourself, but not to tie your worth to that, right? And to say, well, I'm only worth something if I have this position, and to kind of go back to where do I truly, like, at the, my heart of hearts, I know where my worth resides, and let me remind myself of that. So when you have those thoughts, right, step one is catching them. Step two is challenging them. And step three is replacing them with something that's more accurate about what you believe about yourself and God and your relationship with other people.
Oh, I like that. Can you say that again? The steps?
Yes, sure.
Okay,
yeah. So the first one would be to recognize when you're using shoulds or comparing.
Okay.
Recognize, and then challenge. So, okay, wait a second. If I believe that's true, what does that say about what I think about myself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then it's obviously going to lead to a conclusion of, no, that's not actually what I believe. Or if it's what I believe and I don't want to, I need to change it, right? And then step three would be to reframe that thought. So that would be to replace it. I guess you could say reframe or replace, depending on what kind of resonates with you there, but reframing it or replacing it with something that's more accurate about who you believe about yourself and God and others.
Gosh, I think this is such great advice, and I think something we really need right now, especially given everything that's happening in the world. Excuse me. And I'm just thinking, Julia, that, going through this exercise and being people that sort of reframe our expectations so that we can really, truly live out God's plan for our lives through our vocation. I'm thinking that this also could play into our ability to evangelize and reach others. Can you talk about this and sort of how sort of evaluations and our vocation can play a role in our witness at work?
Yeah, I think we all know someone, or maybe more than one person in our lives, that just exudes like a confidence about themselves, right? And you look at them and you think, oh gosh, I don't know, they've got this special quality about them. They know what they're doing. They just seem to have this like sense of purpose, or this inner peace and confidence. And I think that when we've taken that time to evaluate and challenge our expectations, and we're really clear on, these are the strengths I have, these are the talents, I believe this is how I'm called to use them in the workplace, I think we get a little bit or a lot of that confidence. And I think that can speak volumes to our coworkers and our clients that we work with, because they see, wow, this person is acting with just such like surety and confidence, and they're not being swayed by like, this idea that we have to climb, the corporate ladder, and that's the sign of their worth, right? That might still be a goal, of course, but not in the sense of I have to prove myself, but more like I want to challenge myself, right? So I think that even in just that, people can pick up on, that's different, right? That's different than maybe this other way or this other culture at work, and this one person seems to be kind of like peaceful amidst the storm. Like, what's going on there? And I think that can kind of draw people in, right? And they say, what's the difference here? What do they have that I don't have? I want to know more, right?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I'm thinking of some testimonials that we've received from YCP. Lost my voice, excuse me. And, often they mention the words you're describing about a sense of confidence that comes from, knowing who they are as a child of God and having that sense of direction for their lives. And it's peace. And so I think it's exactly that. It's really nothing revolutionary, but it's that sense of grounding. And
Yeah.
I think our coworkers will notice that, like you said, and realize that we're not living for sort of the immediate response from our coworkers or from our bosses or even from a title. We're living for something higher, for something more meaningful, and they'll be drawn to that. So I think it makes perfect sense. Thank you so much for these insights. I think this probably inspired some great questions from our audience. So let's see if we have any questions for Julia. All right, from Dave. What can those in religious vocations do to promote and enable professional vocations and callings that are in the world, yet not of the world?
That's a great question. Thank you, Dave. I appreciate that. I think that maybe in different ways, obviously, religious and then those in professional settings are both called to not be in the world or be in the world. But I think that for religious, I think that they can support professionals by reminding them or encouraging them to see how they can live out their vocation in the workplace, right? That there can be other ways of being, I guess we could say, holy, that we don't have, again, expectations, right? We don't have to have that expectation that we need to be in adoration, 24/7, or that, that's the only way to be holy. And so I think religious can encourage professionals to say, these are ways that you can live out your vocation in your day-to-day life and that you are doing holy work. And here are some ways. Because I think too, religious often go through more training as well, getting theology degrees and things like that, and just their lifestyle, obviously. And so I think they have a lot of gifts and gems that they can share with those in the professional world that we may not have gotten in our formation. So I think there could be a really amazing dialogue between the two.
Totally. And just think of, the verse, pray without ceasing is what we're called to do. And I think we do need help from religious to see how we can pray without ceasing through our work and through our daily actions. I'm going to stop talking because I lost my voice. So we'll see what question we have next. Okay, from Elena. This came at a perfect time. I'm currently pursuing an MSW and interested in therapy. When first started, did you face imposter syndrome? And how did you get past that? Thank you.
Oh, great question, Elena. Wonderful. Being a therapist is an incredibly rewarding career. So I will say that. And I would definitely say I faced imposter syndrome in the beginning. It's terrifying to think about working with your first clients. You go from being in the classroom, doing mock sessions with your classmates, where your classmates are incredibly just easy, right? Where you might suggest an intervention and they'll say, great, that sounds good, I'll work on that, right? And they're very easy, right? So it was very intimidating thinking about working with people and coming to you with real issues that they needed to work through and challenges, and thinking about, oh my gosh, how am I going to be able to help them? But I would say that, whatever program you go through, they will prepare you really well for that. And then also very quickly, you kind of learn that everything that you've gone through in your training, you can put to use when you're working with people. And I think that imposter syndrome starts to fade pretty quickly. But I remember being very intimidated. Oh my gosh, right? These people are trusting me. What am I going to do? I hope I help them. And then it all works out. So,
and I'm sure you probably have a pretty solid prayer routine as you're helping your clients, right? About just sort of God speaking through you, and kind of the litany of humility, I would think would be big. And, I just think of some of my friends and who are in the same role as you are, and it can be a heavy burden, really. And so to kind of offer that back to God, I think is probably critical in your role.
Oh, I would agree. Yes. I think just, authentic self-care is really important, and making sure that, I'm managing stress and setting a schedule and investing in my spiritual growth so that I can be there. And then, yes, prayer before, during, after sessions, with clients, without clients. Yes, absolutely. Because I think it is difficult work, but incredibly rewarding, because there's so much growth and healing that can happen. And it's a gift to witness it. And a lot of times, my clients will say, oh my gosh, thank you so much. I'm like, I don't know, it wasn't me, Holy Spirit, right? Or I always say teamwork makes the dream work, because
Totally.
it's that relationship between the therapist and client where that healing happens. So,
It's got to be
yeah.
so rewarding, like you said. Okay, next question. From Emma, what are your thoughts on defining success differently so it's not achievement based?
That's a great one. I would say that I think when we actually, I'll backtrack and I'll say there's a planner that I really like called the Monk Manual.
Mm-hmm.
And yes. And the founder, Stephen, he's really big about emphasizing being overdoing. And I think that's a great way of talking about success and achievement, that understanding who we are as a person and our being is more important than the actual doing, right? Because if we are just focused, like I mentioned earlier, on this checklist of achievements, or we get trapped in maybe a perfectionistic cycle where I have to be perfect, otherwise I don't feel like I'm worthy. Or if we get stuck in just being busy, like we can't, sometimes my clients will say, I can't sit in silence because then my anxiety will come back or my worries will come back. So I think that those approaching life that way feels like, sometimes I call it a hamster wheel, where you're just like on this hamster wheel and you can't get off because it feels relentless. Like you will never be able to feel at peace or at rest. So I think focusing on that doing, who am I? And am I living that out in what I'm doing, right? So focusing on the being first and letting that inform your doing, I think becomes a much more peaceful way to live your life. And like I was saying earlier, that's not to say that you can't have goals for yourself, or you can't say, yes, I want to get promoted and I want to move up, I was going to say the chain of command, but whatever you want to call it, right?
Yes.
Right, exactly. Like there's nothing wrong with that, but I think it's more, how are you doing that, right? And why are you doing it? Are you doing it because you feel like you have to prove yourself, or are you doing it because you know who you are and you're using your talents and your gifts accordingly?
I just thought of something, and I hope people won't mind if I jump in with one question. So we talked a lot about evaluating our expectations, but what about setting them in the first place? I'm just thinking about, potentially establishing a goal for yourself, ultimate, which is hopefully for all of us here to get to heaven, and to help other people get to heaven. And then we can think about how our expectations fit into that broader goal. Would you say that that's critical to kind of the process?
Definitely, because I think that can almost be like a two-part process, right? Of like identifying and clearing away those faulty expectations. And then you have a blank canvas, right? That you can say, okay, now what expectations do I have for myself that I'm going in fully choosing, and I understand why I'm setting them for myself. So it's not like all expectations are bad. It's just when we adopt them and we don't take that time to say, wait a second, what do I actually think about this expectation, right? Why am I telling myself I should have achieved X, Y, and Z by, 30 years old?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's see what other questions we have. From Krista. Is there a point to which one should keep striving to remain in a certain career path as an evangelization challenge when the default environment is hostile to Catholic and conservative morals?
I think that's a challenge that a lot of people face. Not everybody is working in a Catholic or Christian workplace, for that matter. And it can be very hard. I know that I have some clients who've shared with me how difficult, particularly right now, it's been in the workplace with just, people making comments and things like that, just casually, to say the least. So I think that in that question, I hear a call for discernment and going through that process of discernment and saying, what are some of the reasons or signs that I'm receiving that indicate maybe I am called to stay in this work environment, and then what are some indications that maybe it's time for me to leave. I think sometimes it can be hard to leave someplace we feel like we're failing in some way. But I think that discernment can help with figuring out, is God asking me to close this door and open a new one, or is he asking me to stay in this for some reason? But I think discernment would help with that sort of question for sure.
Definitely. And I think it's something that a lot of people are struggling with, Krista, your question. it's very challenging, because I think there's a fine line between, really offering yourself in your workplace as a witness when the culture is completely hostile. But then you have to make sure that your own, well-being is ensured, and that you can, stay at peace, because God wants us at peace in this life as much as we can be. So it's something that many of us are going through right now. And I think that's why we need community. So I think, Julia, we'll take one more question from you. This has been amazing. So let's see if we have one more question for Julia. From Dave: how do you deal with a situation where others are putting you in a vocation box? You should.
Yes, people like to give out advice, don't they, Dave? Here's what you should do, and this will solve all of your problems. But it's easy for someone to give advice from outside of your situation. I think that, again, discernment can be helpful when people are giving you advice, and to say, what does this person know about me? Also, why are they giving me this type of advice? I think that's helpful too, right? If they're thinking like that I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example sort of off the top of my head here, but I think if they're telling you what your vocation should be, I remember one woman, she had a blog, it was really good. I forget her name, Christina something, but she was talking about how she would go to daily mass, and she was single at the time. And she said that she had all these well-meaning little old ladies coming up to her and saying, do you have a vocation? Have you thought about entering the religious life? And she said it really bothered her, because she had gone through the process and had discerned that she was supposed to be married, and she knew that. And now she's happily married with some cute little kids and everything. But that I loved that story, because her point in that was saying, think about the person who's giving you the advice, and do they really know you? Do they really want what's best for you? Have they actually had a conversation? Are they curious about these things? Or are they just throwing advice at you, right? Because sometimes that can miss all the nuances and the points of what's going on there. So those are some quick thoughts that came to mind with that.
That makes so much sense, Julia. You are so wise, and this has been
well, thank you.
You are. I think this has been a wonderful conversation, and I loved your kind of advice for us: recognize, challenge, then replace. And I love that we should really be looking out for these words that can kind of harm us. We should be doing these things, comparing ourselves to others. Ultimately, we really should be serving God and listening to Him first and honoring Him. And, yes, we can rely on others to help guide us, but ultimately we need to be discerning God's plan for our lives. And I just think that this has been so wonderful. So thank you really so much, Julia.
Thanks for having me. It was a blast.
Okay, we'll see you soon.
Sounds good. Okay.